Cruz. I'm now a visiting professor here, most recently the president of the Sierra Club, which is the largest environmental and oldest environmental organization in the US. And so, but I have also been involved in the international sphere around the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. So it is an honor for me to be introducing today Mr. Farrukh Khan, who's a senior Pakistani diplomat with nearly 3 decades of experience, serving both in national and international positions. He served as the Chief of Staff to the 75th President of the UN General Assembly, and was also Senior Manager for Climate Finance under Ban Ki-moon at the Executive Office of the UN Secretary General. He has been also the Director General of the United Nations, the Organization of Islamic Conference, and Economic Coordination and Economic Diplomacy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and also served in the Pakistani missions to the UN in Geneva and in New York. I remember seeing him a lot around a decade ago during what was called back then the post-2015 agenda, when the Millennium Development Goals were coming to an end and the UN system was in the process of developing what became the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, and the High-Level Political Forum, which is the mechanism that the international community has to track the advancement on the SDGs. And so Mr. Khan, as Pakistan's lead negotiator on climate change, he was also the spokesperson for the developing world at the Rio Plus 20 conference in 2012, in what was called then the G77 plus China. It was a key, or the most important negotiating bloc that was really at the epicenter of the negotiations leading up to the Paris Agreement. So he was, I remember back then I had less white hair than I have now, and seeing a lot of him when you were in front of that, basically the whole world. No? So Mr. Khan was also later on co-chaired the UN Environment Program Working Group that established the UNEP's World Environment Assembly. Was also the chairperson of the Adaptation Fund board, and he was part of the committee that designed what became the Green Climate Fund. Also served as a member of the Green Climate Fund board, and currently he's a member of the governing board of the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, and co-chair of its Standard Oversight Committee. Amongst his academic position, he serves as visiting scholar with the Perry World House in the University of Pennsylvania, and non-resident advisor to the International Institute for Peace. He served also as senior fellow at the Mossavar Remani Center for Government and Business at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's a Columbia University graduate in International Affairs and Law, and he did his Law and Economics undergrad in the University of Punjab in his native Pakistan. So with all these accolades, there is no doubt that we're in front of one of the foremost experts, to give us an update and insight in the, where the international negotiations are and the status of the Paris Agreement, especially in the face of the upcoming COP28 in Dubai, where I know some of you will be there. So, without more, Mr. Khan.
When he met me, I think, as you recall, it was Copenhagen, which was a ballet flop. And I was the chair of finance that day, that unfortunate day that led to. Yet last night, when I was thinking about what can I possibly say intelligently that you guys don't know, and I realized that there is nothing that you don't have access to. There's no graph that I can show you, which you cannot find on Google these days, or if nothing else on Bard or on ChatGPT. And I kept wondering, what is it that I can intelligently give you? So this presentation that you're going to see is a reflection of what I think now. It has no frills. There are no graphs that I'm going to show you from anywhere across the globe. I'm going to give you a pure personal perspective on where things are after investing good about nearly 15, 16 years of my life in these international negotiations from both sides. I have seen it. I was part of the team which drafted Paris Agreement from the UN Secretary General side. So I've seen it from both sides, from the government, from the United Nations. And this, what I see, COP28, and now there are 4 parts of this conversation that I'm going to run you through. At each part, I'll ask you to give me some perspective, which I believe that I'm going to weave into my conclusions that you will see at the end of this presentation. It's not a very long presentation, so I'm not going to bore you a lot. There are only 14 slides. But I'll continue to ask you at each step. The first step is obviously, what do we know about climate change? Where are we? The second part is, what do we expect from, or what is it that the presidency has informed us otherwise that we want to see? The third part of this conversation is, what is it exactly we need? If after 15 years, or most of you have invested your life into climate change, we should know what is it that we need in order to solve the climate equation. What are those key steps which I see are not being given any attention in the negotiations or otherwise? And I'm going to drill down on them, coming down harsh on them. Then I will deal with 2 issues that perhaps are going to ring. One is a taboo, which is carbon pricing, which nobody wants to talk in climate change negotiations. They talk about carbon markets, but nobody will talk about carbon pricing. And then the loss and damage, which will probably be the overarching feature of your conversation or your stay in Dubai. So that said, let's start with, if I can operate this machine. Is it? Am I doing it right?
Push the slide to green.
Oh, okay. Yes. Just to build the context, any of the students you've read, I was part of this negotiation, so I have a very different understanding of what is Paris Agreement. But Paris Agreement is very important. I don't wish to discount the possibility of giving you a perspective that it's not important. I might have different views, but what is Paris Agreement for you? Can anybody tell me what is the most important portion of this agreement? Any student. You're going to be there. I hope you're not as shy as you seem right now. I have tendency to point people. If I
Everybody signed.
everybody signed up, so
That's my answer.
okay. Oh, everybody signed. Okay. So you're saying it's kind of a customary international law. Is that okay? One perspective, please.
Set a target. Set a target.
What is the target? Which target? Oh, the temperature limit, not change. Temperature limit, which is 2 Celsius. What else? Anybody? What is the most important provision of this agreement? Do we know that? What does the agreement say? Yes, please. Partly. So let me give you my perspective. I'm not trying to teach you, but I'm just giving you my perspective. I think you must have read it somewhere. The most important feature, or the legally binding feature in this is an agreement. It's not a protocol, it's not a treaty. It's an agreement. The most important feature of this agreement is putting an obligation on countries to mitigate. How you do it, how much you do it, why you do it is your decision. The only legally binding obligation is Article 4, which says you have to mitigate. Beyond this, there is nothing in this agreement. It's just language. Goals, we know that goal was there. In fact, IPCC has turned that goal, and it says that 2 degrees Celsius is less important than 1.5 Celsius. And I'll just quickly run it through. Does the agreement has power to enforce itself? Anybody? No. Unlike the say trade agreements or otherwise, this agreement is unable to be enforced, at least in a sense of measuring. And I will, in the end, I will come down to what I believe should be our focus in the future in looking at the Paris Agreement. So what do we know? Let me paint from the worst possible scenario in order to come down to my points. What is IPCC saying? We are in an extraordinarily dangerous situation. That's what the science is saying. From the religious standpoint, or from anybody, even your Pope Francis is saying we are collapsing. We are at a breaking point. Secretary General Guterres thinks we are losing the war on climate change. And we are on highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator. That's what we feel. And our ability to actually cope is diminishing far faster than the climate is changing. This is the scenario in which you are entering COP28. Imagine if this was normal. But situation doesn't stop here, it even gets worse. You have seen this year is probably the hottest months on record. 2023 is probably going to be the hottest year on record, and it is still just tip of the iceberg. Since 2015, Paris Agreement, instead of emissions, every year we meet, every year we leaders meet. This is a jamboree of thousands of people getting together in one part of the world or the other. What is the net result? Emissions are increasing. As opposed to Paris Agreement or us as leaders or you as think tanks, that emissions should decrease, the emissions have increased actually. And there is no sign of them dissipating. The Secretary General just issued another statement actually day before yesterday in which he condemned the greed of the oil companies. They banked $4 trillion last year. That's much more than the amount needed to convert the world. The oil companies banked $4 trillion. Anyway, the cost of transition is increasing, running into trillions. Any assessment you pick up, IPCC says 2 to 3 trillion, UNFCCC says 5 to 5.9 trillion. IAEA thinks that even for developing countries we need $1.8 trillion, right? And we are still struggling, by the way, with 100 billion, let alone $1.4 trillion that is needed just for energy transition by 2030. Let alone mitigation, we are talking about adaptation, we need at least $300 billion to just do the adaptation business. In comparison, where we are, according OECD thinks we have made 84 billion of transfer. UNFCCC says it's about 41 billion. There's so much dispute over these figures that it's very difficult to be clear where are we in terms of, let alone the climate change financing or development financing, how much the transition is happening. You know, World Green Climate Fund that we created at that moment with a big it channels 1.5 to maximum $2 billion a year. It has assets under management which are about $32 billion now in 10 years, and that's about all. To increase that amount, and I will also come down to this financing point and explain it to you why I think that there is a need. Overall, we are very close to breaking 1.5 barrier. It is expected within next 2 years, and it's possible we may have crossed it, at least a spike, a temporary spike, not that we are permanently crossing, but by 2027 we are likely to be crossing the 1.5. That's what science says now. That's how dangerous it has become. And can you believe it? Now, with this scenario, the adaptation window is closing. How much can you adaptate to this situation? Do we realize the enormity of the challenge we are facing? We cannot make any more adaptation because the mitigation is not happening. And whosoever is telling you that adaptation is a question of finance is wrong. We need to have mitigation for adaptation to have an impact. And this is just a few things that I wanted to tell you more starkly. You have heard about Arizona, Southern Europe. In Japan, temperature crossed 50. UAE, where you would be, 50 degrees Celsius, deadly heat waves in different parts of the world. Antarctic ice is almost 500,000 square miles less. And then you have El Nino. This is the scenario in which you are entering COP28. And you are looking for solutions. We'll come down to solution from my perspective, and hopefully I will have something to share with you. These are some other figures that I thought to complement. Now let's move to, again, coming back to you. After this scenario, if I were to come back to you and ask you, guys, as you enter Dubai, what are you most confident about? Anyone? What are you most confident about? Do you think your leaders are actually capable of solving this situation? Do you have high confidence in this? What is the high confidence level you have? What is the lowest confidence you have in? Anyone? Speak up. You're going to change the world. Come on.
Highly confident there'll be a lot of hollow pledges that mean nothing.
That's one. Very true. Anybody else? We'll come down to this point. Yes?
I'm highly confident that we will do something, but I'm lowly confident that we'll do it in time. And I'm highly confident that we'll go above the 1.5 and 2 degrees target.
Yeah, something similar. I'm highly confident that trends won't be radical changes, more small incremental steps.
But do you realize how much time do you have? Have you studied that? There is no time left to take actions. The action is needed now. It was needed yesterday. How many incremental steps do you want to take in order to save the world? But okay, we'll come down to this pooling of your views subsequently, and moving on to what do we expect COP28 to deliver. First thing, are we confident that it can reach 1.5? No. But that's the need of the hour. As of now, at least the presidency says that we will focus on these issues. So for you, the COP in different segments, from adaptation to resilience, on the ambition side, it needs to bridge the gap. Do you know how much gap is there in emissions from NDCs? Anyone? Well, you're going to COP28, you should know at least. It's 20 to 23 gigaton of gap between NDCs and the requirement of meeting 43% by 2010 levels, which is a huge gap. Meeting that gap is not, it's not easy to think that we can meet 20 gigatons of gap. And 20 gigatons if we want 2 degrees Celsius. 23 gigaton if we are talking about 1.5 Celsius scenario. What do we need? Subsidies, removal, decarbonizing industry, a set of concrete solutions that can link us with the science. On trust, do you think there is enough trust in negotiation? Do you trust? We have not given 100 billion, and I showed you all these figures, so I'm now connecting all that different scenarios I showed you with the subsequent part. We have not met 100 billion that I recall having agreed to in Copenhagen. And when was Copenhagen? 2009. It's been 14 years. That 100 billion, but the need has increased to how much? Trillions of dollars by now. So look at the enormity of challenge. And then you have to have a new pathway, which the negotiators are struggling to figure out what is that new goal we need on finance. Vulnerability, operationalizing the loss and damage fund, governance and possible financial layout. I'm going to come down to loss and damage because I negotiated the existence of this fund. So I'm going to give you a perspective how we negotiated it and why we negotiated it. Global goal on adaptation, which is another thing, just transition, and of course carbon markets, which is a part of the solution, something that none of us or the governments are unable to agree or find a solution to. In your view, coming back again to you, what is possible on mitigation? If you were sitting there as negotiators, what would you agree? Do you have any idea how either of these goals or either of these things are going to pan out? Anyone? Take a wild guess, guys. Don't hesitate. There is no right answer because whatever you are going to, they are going to agree with, probably you won't even know. So tell me.
I guess this is more in the finance category, but I think there is a push for investment firms in particular to think about sustainability in their strategies, not just out of altruism, but also because they're starting to realize that for financial success in the future, they're going to need to take into consideration.
Yeah. Partly you're right, but if I were to ask you, if you were drafting that language, what would you say it should be aligned to? Should it align to, let me facilitate, should it align to net zero target? Should it align to 1.5 Celsius? Should it align to 2 degrees Celsius? What task are you giving the investment community?
I mean, I think it depends on the risk tolerance of the different firms, but I think it should be a main consideration in the risk assessment. So probably I would only.
We started this, if you recall, in 2014, the summit which I was part of, which laid the foundation of Paris Agreement, the whole voluntary side of the investment firms, and I was in charge of the finance, where we brought all these actors from pension funds to investment banks together to start thinking about the voluntary side of making commitments. Those commitments are still happening. I thought we did an innovation which would translate into something bigger. Lo behold, 9 years, we are still there. We're still thinking about voluntary commitments from investment community, which doesn't translate much into the reality. But it's a good thing. I would not say. Back then it was innovation. So what could be a success at COP28? From my perspective, and I want you to think, I gave you the perspective why NDCs or the Paris Agreement, the only thing binding in Paris Agreement is that you should have your targets, how you do it, when you do it. This is all your prerogative. That is how we negotiated, because the US was unable to negotiate anything else. And we had to accommodate the United States because it's one of the biggest players. If US is not on board with the guy which does most emissions, the whole thing, charade, doesn't make sense. So what do you need to, if you were to ask me, instead of your target being aligned to some obscure sense in Paris Agreement, the change that we need, and it is a change which is difficult, very difficult, is to have NDC's target which are aligned with 1.5 scenario. None of the country has done this alignment thus far. And this is the challenge. If you want to meet, if I were to see what can be a successful outcome for you, something that you can all focus on, is to see that these indices, which are the linchpin, the innovation of Paris Agreement after the Kyoto Protocol, they should lead to some result, and that is alignment with 1.5 scenario. Then enforcing the implementation. I understand, as a lawyer myself, that it is the country's practice that determines international law. WTO is one example with a very good enforcement mechanism. Mostly people cite WTO. I was also trained in trade law as well. But there are number of, if you look at the scenario of enforcement, I hope some of you would undertake actually a project on enforcement at some point. Look at the human rights regime, look at the environmental regime, look at the trade regime, and you will find very different ways of enforcement mechanisms. And they don't have to be intrusive. They can be ranging from naming and shaming to, like in the case of human rights regime, every agreement has its own treaty development mechanism which secures implementation, does not enforces but secures implementation by discussing it with the country, what is it that you are needing at any. So there are different ways, but enforcement is needed. The precipice that we are standing today cannot be handled without enforcement of the Paris Agreement, or otherwise this agreement is just remains on the piece of paper, which it has thus far, because the trend should have been opposite. What you are seeing is the increase in emission. The reality is different. We might be clear that it is one of the agreements that we should hold. Then strengthening mitigation effort. This is a debate that is ongoing. This is the only debate that is ongoing, phasing out date for fossil fuels. What is that date? Should it be 2030? Should it be 2027? The challenge is that it should start in 2027, most likely, in order to be able to. Then removing domestic subsidies, something that my very close friends don't agree. I will not name them. Removing domestic subsidies on oil and gas. Then the third thing, and I have written a piece which I will talk more about this. Last month I wrote in Foreign Affairs a piece on a new approach to global carbon pricing floor. What can be that we have been, and I'll give you some glimpse of it, but it is available, and I will ask, I will give Keely a copy of PDF version for you to circulate. It's the proposal on a global carbon pricing framework. But this is a taboo. If you don't make emissions expensive, you will not solve. I want to tell you very clearly, and you should, at least as a practitioner and coming from developing countries, there is no solution to climate change challenge without pricing carbon. It has to be that simple. So long as we will continue to skirt this issue, we will not solve climate change. Barring aside, increasing the flow of financing, we want to see, and then an innovative loss and damage fund that can respond to the challenges of where we are. If I were to expect something, these are the things that I would want in a COP28. For a credible agreement, these are the issues that you need to address. The rest of it are important, but their effectiveness hinges on taking these decisions. How many of you think that COP can take these decisions?
Can or will?
Can. At COP28, how many of you thinks out of this there could be any decision? Anyone, please.
I don't follow the negotiations that closely, but I think something on, for example, an agreement on global carbon pricing. I know there's been some talk about that
let me give you an insight. If you look at the COP's outcome, the word carbon pricing does not appear anywhere in that agreement. At best, from Glasgow, you can see the word carbon markets. You will not see the word carbon price anywhere. That is why I have put it as a challenge. If you do not create a global framework, and I can explain it to you subsequently, shortly, why I think it's important. But this is what I believe I showed you what is possible from COP28 perspective. There are many things that needs to be done. But if you drill it down to all these work programs and humanitarian relief and integration with the challenge that I showed you from the beginning, it does not require a work program. Let's put this very frankly. It requires actions. Agreement on a set of actions that will make it credible for you to think that we have done something. So this is, in my view, a definition of success. Now, I wanted to give you a perspective. Two things that I said will be very important for you in COP28, and one of them is the loss and damage. I share a story with you so that you understand where I'm coming from. When my minister, we were the chair of Group of 77, I was specially flown into Sharm el-Sheikh to create a situation in which we could make it possible. And when my minister had asked me, I told her that this was a bad idea. I don't think we need a loss and damage fund. And let me tell you why. I've created 3-4 of such funds, from Adaptation Fund to Green Climate Fund. And we did this because this was a political challenge. So when we were told that, no, it needs to be done, so we said, fine, we'll make it happen. And that is a different story how we made it happen. But let me give you a few snippets of my thinking on loss and damage so that you understand where I'm coming from. How big can this fund be? I gave you what is GCF. $1.5 to $2 billion GCF after 12 years. 1.2 billion. The capital value. How much is the World Bank? Let me start from here. How much is the World Bank capital value? Anybody knows that? About $90-95 billion. About 90-95. When was World Bank established? 1945? Do you know what is the staffing of World Bank? It's 38,000 people. It takes 38,000 people to channel $90 billion. Your demand for a $100 billion fund, do you realize how, I don't wish to get exuberant in my, but what I'm saying, it took us 12 years to build. GCF has a staff of 4,500 people right now to channel $1.5 to $2 billion. For an input to come, you need a throughput. To build a fund is not a small thing. But let's imagine this could be $500 billion, 500 million initial layout, $1 billion, maybe $2 billion. Let's get wild, $3 billion loss and damage fund. How many countries? 150 countries, you divide over them, not more than 20 million will come in any country's share. You look at adaptation, that's what has happened. Look at data. And what was the hit in Pakistan? From $32 billion. So you are investing, 150 countries are investing their political capital on creating a mechanism that will deliver them $20 million at most in one given project. Does it sound okay to you? It doesn't. But it was a question of justice, as I was told, that we need to create this fund. So we did. We had to go through many loops in order to get that agreement, but it is there now. Now the challenge is, now that we have created, what kind of structure do we need? Should it be a traditional fund with a board sitting there taking decision three times a year? Hit comes suddenly, flash floods in Libya, the damage is more than $40 billion. Who's going to support? A board will come and sit, and then the board should have a project proposal about Libya to understand where it can support. This is how you want a fund? No, you need to think differently. That's the challenge you will see in COP28. This fund cannot be the traditional way of looking at fund. Building this fund like we have built it in the case of GCF, like GCF, I was part and parcel of its creation, there was a different thinking. What I see, this fund is being created in the same way. There is going to be a board. And what is that board going to do? What's the role of this board? You see, you have to question in order to understand what is the innovation you need. And I have been guiding some people within the transitional committee. Otherwise, I have spoken that the approach that transitional committee has taken is upside down. That is not the fund we need. For them to come up with a structure which has a board, a fund, a secretariat, it takes 4 months. Right now, if you go to Green Climate Fund, it takes 1.5 years to 2 years for you to get funded. And we are talking about a project of $200 million to $500 million. This is loss and damage. This is not that scenario. You cannot do the same thing for a scenario which is entirely different. You need a different scenario. Anybody has any idea? Have you worked on loss and damage fund governance structure? What will you do when you go to Dubai and they ask you, what do you think we should do? Has anybody thought? That fund. I think we need to think a bit differently, and this is where I wanted to plant a thought in you. The solution to this lies in the funding arrangements. If there is a fund, you need to bring all multilateral development system and humanitarian system on a single platform, like a kind of an impact council, not the board, but a council, where the heads of UN agencies or World Bank or their representatives can come and decide immediately about a situation. So let's say OCHA, World Bank, all are sitting on a single platform. What are they going to do? Now that's the question we need to address. That's where we need thresholds. Decision making should not be on project proposals but on a threshold. If a country is hit and the damage is 4% of its GDP, then there should be automatic action that each of these organizations is able to take. The World Bank should say, I start IDA, I suspend debt relief, I suspend the debt repayments. IMF should say, I am doing this much of SDR rights. Humanitarian agencies should say, these are the 4 steps I am going to take. This pooling of resources alongside this fund, which is, again, I am going to say, not going to be more than, let's say, even if it's wildest imagination, $5 billion, which will take at least 20 years to build. Like I said, 38,000 people need to channel $90 billion, and 4,000 people need to be channeling 1.5. Imagine how many people will need for $5 billion. Plus, you have to select them. They're selected from across the globe before they can start functioning on a $5 billion fund. But even if we think about it that way, we need to, that fund needs to be different. The long and short of this whole conversation, I know that I have to at some point finish, is this fund needs to be different, and it need not have multiple layers of governance structure that we have in Green Climate Fund, but an ability to blend resources. That's what you need to do. You need a structure in which the response is quicker, where everyone comes together in order to handle a situation in Libya or in India or in any other part of the world where the catastrophe or an event takes place. Say so is the case, you would say, oh, what to do about the slow onset event? How would you create a threshold on slow onset event? It's not that challenging. We still need to discuss, but if your risk rating, let's say Maldives, if your risk rating moves from IPCC standing from moderate to higher, the mechanism should trigger. Similar way, they should start responding to a situation. So this is what I think you are going to have a lot on the loss and damage fund. I hope it is going to be decided one way or the other. I've given you a different perspective on what I think this was. This doesn't solve the problem. We are looking at trillions of dollars of mobilization. So a loss and damage fund of a few $1 billion can only do so much. And that too, if it is combined with other resources. That's where you need to think differently. I hope one of you will actually do a paper on this before you go. Carbon pricing, like I said, this is my final point. I want to conclude. If there is one credible outcome of this COP28, anything that will wring credibility is finding a solution to pricing carbon without making expensive emissions expensive. There is, in my view, again, any one of you could differ, without making those emissions expensive, there is no solution to climate challenge. I have proposed a new global carbon pricing floor, which should start in the developing countries at $10 and $40 in the developed countries. And it should be supported by a fund of $10 billion in order to, which is actually, it's a spin-off of the IMF proposal. IMF proposed it earlier in one of its proposals, that in order to create infrastructure around carbon pricing, you need to incentivize developing countries. And for that to happen, and there is a lack of infrastructure, there is a lack of understanding. It is mind-boggling. Most of you would probably, the economists, the scientists, the international heads of agencies and agencies, all of them agree, including IPCC, that pricing carbon is central to solution. And you know who does not agree? COP28, or the leaders who are going to be there. The only people who do not agree on carbon pricing are the politicians. At least, as I see, 50 years of experience, analysis, and 30 years of empirical evidence that you have seen from nearly now 46 countries with 68 carbon pricing mechanisms and instruments spread across the globe, the one conclusion that I draw is that carbon pricing is socially, politically, economically beneficial. And that's the message we should carry for this COP. I'll stop here if there are any questions, but I wanted to give you these two conclusions that I asked you in the first. I think we have high confidence that the Earth temperature is on track to breach, and we have low confidence that our leaders will be able to change that trajectory. This is the environment, this is the situation, this is the perspective that I wanted you to carry as you move into COP28. Thank you so much.
You see that the
very high confidence we'll breach the temperature limit, and we have very low confidence that we will find a solution to mitigate. So, but then you are arguing that now we should like focus more on mitigation, but the point is that realistically, the temperature will still continue to increase, emissions continue to increase. Yes, we do have to address the cost, but now that the cost is already there, we should still address the effect of adapting to the climate change, right? So could you clarify your position on that?
The point I'm trying to convey to you on resilience or on adaptation, these are important things, notwithstanding. You have to do. But there is so much adaptation that you can do in a 1.5 degree scenario, and if you breach it, not only your cost is increasing, but that adaptation that you will undertake will not last longer. So what you are doing now, if you are moving and breaching 1.5, you are investing into a process which will not lead to results. So in order for adaptation to be effective or resilience to be effective, you need to address the mitigation side more aggressively. Otherwise, you will probably won't have results. Yes, ma'am.
So when the president of France tried to implement a tax on carbon recently, there was a full-fledged rebellion that lasted several days in a street of a lot of money in conflict with government. And that is just one example. I think that image of the yellow vest has been ingrained in the head state of every single European and probably every country in the world. This is what happens when you try to raise the cost of carbon. And it makes sense because the whole society is set up in such a way that people, especially in lower income brackets, are having to drive to their jobs. And even that small amount of increase in the price of gas would have meant a very big impact for them. And so my point is that any of these measures will have an negative economic impact on a lot of people, and that's what governments are trying to avoid because they're looking in 4-year intervals. And so I think that's the impossible friction that this is why we're stuck.
That's not correct. Let me tell you why. Do you know how much revenue did the carbon pricing mechanism, these 46 countries or 68 instruments generated last year? You would be surprised. It's $100 billion of revenue that comes from the carbon pricing instruments. If you channel, currently 40% of that revenue is being channeled towards low-income countries or low-income families. The solution exists in the carbon pricing mechanism. The revenue generated, a part of that revenue is targeted to the low-income families in order to buffer what led to that rebellion. If the governments are able to communicate this, that we will be providing a buffer to the low-income families, I don't think that will be the case, because if you look at the empirical data, it has actually buffered. Now, if you channel 2 to 5% of this revenue of 100 billion towards developing countries, how much money are we talking about? $5 billion minimum. So it has far more important benefits economically, socially, politically than what is being perceived. So what I am trying to communicate to you is there is a factor of information that is missing in this piece. The governments are unable to communicate properly what carbon pricing and how its implementation could be useful. Yes, please.
I didn't follow up on that. I mean, the reason they're unable to communicate that effectively is partly because there are strong entrenched interests that have no interest
Precisely.
in communicating effectively.
Precisely.
So to airbrush those forces out of this picture and to speak of carbon pricing abstractly rather than the Swiss cheese reality of what carbon pricing, even in the most effective jurisdiction, transnational jurisdiction we have it, in the European Union is, where heavy industry is carved out in order to placate them. And it took 20 years for us to get any sort of meaningful carbon price in that jurisdiction. on board such they're willing to accept that cost?
Again, let me give you a counter argument to this. First of all, the prices have not remained meaningless now. The trouble with this equation is you're looking at the global average. When you global average out the carbon pricing, you get $3 or $2 or $1, and you think that's missing meaning. The real indicator to look at is the median price. If you look at the median price levels in developing countries and in developed countries, you will find an entirely different picture. On country basis. If you look at the median price, it's around $10 in developing countries right now. So the markets and countries who have been able to figure out the carbon pricing have changed themselves. Carbon pricing instrument is being adopted in Indonesia. India is coming up with one mechanism. Uruguay. Many developing countries are moving in this direction. Now your second point about why would this happen? Because there are entrenched interests. In order to buffer this, this is where the incentive of financing would play its role. I would request, I hope you will circulate that paper because it makes that case. Creating an incentive would actually mitigate the forces which are continuing to prevent these the challenge of meeting carbon pricing. As of now, the opposition, apart from the US, for one reason or the other, the opposition comes from the developing countries on pricing carbon. Majority of the opposition in global pricing framework comes from the developing countries who are suffering. If you look at the data, they have actually suffered more from the event than they would suffer from the carbon pricing instrument, in which they can also have a buffer which can be targeted towards the low income countries. Information is important here, how we communicate. Solutions exist. That's the point here.
I want to change the topic a little bit, even though I also have a strong opinion about carbon pricing, so I want to get into that. I want to go back to your slide where you show what are the aspects you will define success for COP28. I agree with the importance of each one of them. My question is, do you really think COP28 or COP in general is the right platform for those conversations to happen? Or for some of them, such as carbon pricing or the wrenching of NDC, maybe we're better off starting this conversation in smaller clubs and then gradually bring that success to COP.
Okay, which one of these would you want not to happen in?
So I'd love to hear your thoughts. So for example, strengthening NDC, I was thinking maybe we can start with the countries who have already pledged net zero targets. And for the one about the global carbon pricing, I wonder if we're better off starting with G7, G20, or the other platform where they already have like bilateral, multilateral conversations, China, India, US, major players together. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
G7, I think part of the challenge is to signal how you want to address it. I don't think that you will find a solution at COP28 on global carbon pricing. So, but as a negotiator of my previous life, there are different ways you can cut this equation. Why can't you create a high-level group under the Secretary General comprising World Bank and others and say, okay, let's discuss. By next year, we want to determine what could be a global carbon pricing floor. Let's have that discussion. Bring all the expertise you want. So there are ways of addressing that issue. That call can be made at COP28, signaling, requesting the Secretary General, or inviting him that this is an important issue of credibility. Why don't we create a high-level committee of sorts that he can? Of course it can happen in DC. Of course it can happen in G7 countries. You have to attack this issue from many different sides in order for it to get resolved. It's not going to get resolved at COP28, but the credibility signal is important. One more question. You, sir.
How would you, in an ideal world, go about bridging the divides that I think, of course, will very obvious between developing and developing countries as they have fights within the international sea system, especially on the mitigation issues? I think since COP26, become more
My last slide says more about this, that yes, I agree with you. This is where, sorry, I don't. Okay, just this slide actually says what you're saying, the level of confidence as it exists. In this scenario where you are, I mentioned it in one of the slides that since yesterday situation has become even more difficult with what is going on in Middle East, Palestine, war in Ukraine, inflation, economic challenges across the globe, the unsustainability of debt burdens. The situation has become more challenging. But if I were somewhere sitting in a position where I could influence, I would think about what is one thing that I want that can send the signal that we are as leaders ready to face the world. And I showed you 5 slides of where we are in the world. We are on an irredeemable path. And in my view, that one thing is signaling that we will make emissions expensive. I know it's challenging, but instead of finding solutions to everything, we could perhaps focus the COP or the processes on finding solution to one thing that can make the process credible. Otherwise, you will come back tomorrow. Maybe these people can pool some views and see what have you achieved or what has the COP achieved. Guys, thank you so much. It was a